In this video, we will discuss one of the distinctive features of Python, that is indentation. Indentation in the programming is used basically to improve the readability of the code, and this indentation is ignored by the compiler or the interpreter, and it is not necessary in most of the standard programming languages like C, C++ or Java. But in Python, indentation is made as mandate. That is, in Python, it is a must to follow indentation. In most of the computer programming languages, indentation is used to format program source code and to improve the code readability. Most of the earlier languages like C, C++, Java use curly braces to indicate a block of code and is only useful for programmers or developers to improve the code readability. And the indentation is ignored by the compilers or interpreter. That is, compilers or interpreters rarely care how much white spaces is present in between the statement or before the statements. But in Python, indentation is an important concept and which is mandated in Python. So now in this video, we'll see what indentation is and how it is useful in Python. Consider the sample code snippet written in C programming, so which do not follow any indentation. So even if the indentation is not followed also, the program can be compiled and executed without any issue. So consider this code snippet, so which is following an improper indentation. So you can see that the indentation is much improper. So even then the code can be compiled without any syntax errors and the code can be executed without any runtime error. So whether indentation has to be followed or not, so that can be decided by the programmer, and it is not a mandatory in other programming languages like C, C++ or Java. But when you follow the indentation, the code looks beautiful and it improves the readability in the code. So consider this code snippet where indentation is followed. So here you can observe that there are two blocks of code, and again, so in this code again there are few other blocks. So indentation is used to indicate a block of code. So in C programming, basically a block of code can be designated using the curly braces. But in Python, so curly braces are not used to support the designation of blocks. But indentation is used to designate a block of code in Python programming. A block of code in Python is designated with uniform indentation. So consider this example code snippet. So all these set of statements that are belonging to the same block as they are following uniform indentation. So consider this code snippet, so where one of the statement is indented. So whenever there are some statements as part of the control structures or functions or as part of the class, then those set of statements must be indented to indicate that a new block starts. So here we have only one single statement and we are giving some indentation. So when the statements are unindented, then again we indicate that the block is completed and so the code is belonging to the previous block itself. Consider these set of statements where we have few blocks. So here if you observe the statement that is part of the if control structure, so it's following a separate indentation, and the statement that is part of the elif block, so it's following a different indentation. The statement that is part of else block, it's following so a different indentation. So that is how each block, here we have so 4 different blocks of code. So the whole set of statements, they are belonging to a common block, and again whenever you see the indentation, you can understand that a new block starts. The inner block is completed, and again this statement whichever is unindented, it is belonging to the outer block statement. So that is how to indicate a separate block in Python. Indentation is helpful. So now let's see if we do not follow any indentation, what is the problem. Here I am giving an indentation to this statement, and let's try to run this code. So here, so you are getting an error, syntax error, so which is saying that expected an indented block. So whenever there is a control structure and if you have any statement as part of the control structure, it is required to indent those set of statements. So now I am giving indentation. So indentation need not to be of any specific number of spaces. So it could be of 1 space, 2 spaces or 3 spaces. But so it is a common practice to give a tab space to designate the new block or the indentation. So it is a common practice to give 4 to 5 spaces for the indentation to designate a different block. So now the indentation is proper, and now try to execute this part of code. So here you can observe that. So the code is executing without any syntax error. So that's how when you violate the indentation constraint, which is mandatory in Python, so it generates syntax errors. So to avoid such kind of errors, it is a must to follow indentation in Python. So now I hope you understand what indentation is, and now let's check some of the case studies to understand where it is required to follow indentation and where you should not use any indentation to avoid syntactical errors that are related to indentation. So here if you observe, this code snippet does not contain any control structure. So in that case, it is not required to follow any indentation, and all the statements must be of uniform indentation. If your code do not have any control structure, any function, any class, any module, then it is not required to follow any indentation. All the code statements here in this case are belonging to a single block, and they need to be followed the uniform indentation. And now let's execute this code. So your code is executed successfully in this case, as there is no indentation error. Let's give an indentation to a specific statement which is not required actually. So now this statement, if you observe, so it's not part of the control structure, neither it's a part of the function, and still I am giving some indentation to this statement. So let's see what happens. So here you can see unexpected indent. So you are getting a syntax error saying that it's an unexpected indentation error in the code. So that's how, unexpected indentation should be avoided in the code. Now it is clear that when the code do not contain any control structure, all the statements must be of uniform indentation. Now let's see how we can use indentation associated with various control structures. So consider this if-else control structure. So and how indentation has to be followed while using the conditional control structures. So here if you observe, statements that are part of the if block, so they need to be indented uniformly, and similarly the statements that are part of the elif block, so they need to be uniformly indented. And again the statements that are part of the else block, they need to be uniformly indented. So that means a block of the statements must follow uniform indentation. When a statement is unindented, so that means that the statement will be belonging to the outer block and not belonging to the inner block. So here if you observe, these two statements are part of the else block and this statement is unindented. So that indicates that this statement is belonging to the outer block. So that is how we can follow indentation in the conditional control structures. So let's see what happens if you avoid the indentation in the if-else structure. So now I am giving different indentations to the same block of statements. Now let's see what happens. A syntax error is generated which shows unexpected indentation error. So you need to avoid such kind of errors. To avoid these kind of errors, you need to follow uniform indentation to the statements that are belonging to the same block. When the statements that are part of the same block, so if they follow uniform indentation, these kind of errors can be avoided. So now consider this code snippet which contains a while loop. So here if you observe, the statements that are part of the while loop, so they need to be uniformly indented, indicating that these two statements are part of the while loop. And when the statement is unindented, that means that this statement is not part of the while loop and the statement is belonging to the outer block. Now let's consider this code snippet which contains a for loop and how indentation has to be followed here. So let's observe that. So here if you observe, the set of statements that are part of the for loop, so they constitute a different block, so they are following the uniform indentation. And again inside this for loop, there is another control structure. So again statements that are part of that control structure need to start with different indentation. So that is how the set of statements that are belonging to different blocks need to follow different indentation, and the statements that are part of the same block need to follow uniform indentation. Now consider this code snippet which contains a function. The set of statements that are part of the function need to follow uniform indentation. Here if you observe, these two statements are part of the function fun, so they need to follow uniform indentation. And again this statement is unindented, indicating that this statement is not part of the function fun. So that's how the statements that are part of a single block has to follow uniform indentation. Whenever the code contains any control structure, the statements that are part of those control structures need to follow uniform indentation. So now I hope you understand how to use indentation in Python and how Python indentation helps us to avoid certain kind of errors. So thank you for watching this video.